This Talking Flutes podcast is kindly sponsored by Trevor James Flutes, making life sound beautiful. You can show them some flute love by following them on Instagram at TJ Flutes, Trevor James Flutes on Facebook, and at trevorjamesflutes.com. Hello there, and welcome this week to Talking Flutes Extra with me, Jean-Paul Wright. Thank you so much for all your lovely responses to the last two podcasts by Claire with the wonderful Atara Bentovim. Atara really has been a tour de force in the flute world, who began to open doors for female flute players in a very much male-dominated environment back in the 1960s and 70s. If you haven't listened to them, I do recommend that you go back. They are wonderful. Thank you also for the emails and messages on social media about the meditation podcast. I'm so pleased that many of you like the introduction to creative visualization, meditation and mindfulness, a real passion of mine. Don't forget to visit thehappyflutist.com, where you'll find 26 beautiful tracks to unwind, chill, meditate or do yoga to. There are also some guided meditations there. And thehappyflutist.com is completely free to access, with no logins and no passwords required. Before we speak to this week's guest, just a quick thank you from Claire and I to all our long-suffering podcast listeners, as one of our podcast providers, who we upload to each week, called Podbean, informed us that we have now exceeded 200,000 downloads with them alone. Wow, thank you to everybody. So this week, I'm dialing in with the technical director of Trevor James Flutes, or otherwise known as TJ Flutes, based in Lenham, just outside of London, called David Farley. The TJ brand is known around the world via its social media presence for experimenting and making wonderful instruments accessible. Their passion for making beautiful alto flutes has certainly changed the popularity and landscape of a once endangered species. Yes, alto flutes weren't always as popular. David Farley heads up the technical team and R&D meetings at TJ Flutes, where they gather feedback from testing and experimentation using players around the world. So I started the call with asking him how all this started. So where did this fascination for technical detail, and especially on the woodwind instruments, because you're not only, you're known for flute designing and working with flutes, but also what people listening to this won't know is you're also a bit of a pro on saxophones and flutes and clarinets, in fact, everything. So where did this fascination actually start, David?
Well, actually, I kind of started playing the flute when I was, 7, I think, and so I've always had that early 1970s kind of flute fascination and enjoyed my instrument, having moved across from recorder, as it were, and sort of trained as a teacher and a player, and later had an opportunity to come here at Trevor James, and obviously that's where it all kind of came to fruition, really. I suddenly found what I was really wanting to do, which was to work with the instrument that I loved. And as a result of my association with Trevor James for the last 30 years now, I've actually been introduced to various instruments that I probably wouldn't have done otherwise, which namely the saxophones, clarinets as well, and various other woodwind instruments that, of course, we've had to develop and do our best to try and meet the need of the market.
So before we delve deep into the flute, because it's a flute podcast, I just want to touch on the developments that you've built up over the years, this art of detail. In other words, this real fascination for measurements, understanding what works in an instrument and what doesn't work, and why it worked in a previous design or a previous brand name. So if we go back a step and let's look at the saxophone very, very briefly, in that the TJ saxes for 20 years were known as student and step up. And the top level saxophones, the professional saxophones, were really down to 3 or 4 brands. And it was virtually impossible to break into that, wasn't it? How did
Yes.
you take an instrument and bring it to what is known now as this professional sax called the Signature Custom Saxes sits happily alongside all the other professional saxes. What made you believe that you could design and then build a sax that could work with all the other established brands?
Yes, very good question. I think the answer is quite squarely that I actually sought advice. And I sought advice from the people that matter, who are the players. And I've been very blessed with associations with a number of very leading people who have helped us as a company, have put us on the right track, have given us clues and ideas. Sometimes they're hurdles to jump over, sometimes they're sparks of an idea. But with those ideas, you can then start to formulate a technical approach to how to make that work. And slowly but surely, you find the right formula. So there is no magic. I'm not a great scientist. I'm not a great kind of a technical person in that respect. But what I do appreciate is the fact that it's the players that know what they need, and not for me to tell them.
But you must have taken a raw product to them. And I mean, your knowledge of, let's look at Selmer Mark 6s and all the top professional saxes. You know how they're built. You know what metals you use. You know the tone hole placings.
Absolutely. Exactly.
So what made you confident that you could take a bass instrument to them, as in bassline instrument, not a bass sax, but a bassline instrument to these players and say, how close are we? And I say that because you've worked with one of the world's leading saxophone players, Andy Shepherd, in developing his own $10,000 sax on a limited edition run, which is almost sold out. Where did you start with that product? Because it must have been good to start with, for the players to agree to come in and say, actually, you're quite close.
Yes. Well, I think a lot of it really is looking at what you've got that works already. Where, what are the good points about what you've been working on and what you've had, and then looking at where the shortfalls are. And the shortfalls can fall into a lot of categories, but obviously with professional players, we're talking about intonation, we're talking about sound, we're talking about ergonomics and all sorts of aspects. And all of these things, need to be refined somehow. There were a number of things that happened that I was quite lucky to have found with regard to saxophones, but it's really, I could go into now, but I think I won't for the moment. But there is lots of detail there should you wish to find it. So it's really a matter of taking the saxophone, seeing what you've got that's right, and then working through all of the areas that there is a shortfall, and trying to reverse engineer. Now, when you look back to the past, you've got clues, you've got, some of them are serendipity. Sometimes things happen out of our control and they can't be repeated. But when you find something that works, it's a matter of looking at it objectively and seeing what it is that you believe has made that item work. And then what can you take from that? And so I've kind of very much taken a slow approach to the development of our saxophones, because I wanted to understand what it is that actually makes these things work well. I'm not one for homage sort of products and jumping on bandwagons or anything. What I really would like to do is to try and find out what works. And over the years, you develop more understanding of how that airflow works, what happens, what the material can and can't do. And you also associate yourself with a lot of other people that have ideas too, and you can share those and actually benefit from them. So I wouldn't personally say that I have personally found all of these things. It is my interpretation of what other people have suggested.
And you've gone to some of the world's leading horn players, and they've given. I remember quite a few years ago, you working with Dave Alexander?
Eric Alexander,
Not Eric
and
Alexander.
Dave O'Higgins.
Dave O'Higgins.
Dave
that's
O'Higgins,
the one.
yes.
And Dave had one of the first prototypes you were building of the Pro Sax.
Yes.
And he was sending you these audios and just saying the upper partials were slightly out up here. The upper partials were
exactly.
How do you work from a technical perspective when you're told that?
It's quite daunting, really. It's quite daunting, but but like all journeys, it starts with the first step, and of course, you start looking at what you can do with that information easily, what you don't understand, and then you start to experiment and to have a look and see what you can work out. And I mean, I'm over the years, because I've taken it in a very structured way, and you end up with a formula which works better than, and sometimes these things do have a habit of, three good ideas leads to a bigger sum than their parts, if you know what I mean. So maybe two or three areas actually fix another area as well. And it's really, I mean, it's trying not to be daunted. Look at it from look at what you can do, look at what you just have no idea how to fix, and then work through it in a structured way. And that's what I would do.
Yeah, well, ultimately, as you always say, it's the players that decide. It's not the makers, the designers, the manufacturers. You've got to get the player.
No, absolutely. I mean, the players out there are the people that we are trying to support. We're trying to support live music. We're trying to support orchestral music and real music. And the point is that if as a manufacturer you can't do that, you can't support that player, or you don't give that player enough free rein to give you advice, then I think you're missing the point. And that's would be my biggest philosophy, I think, is that if the player doesn't know what they want, how do you know?
Yeah, well, I would totally agree with that. Do you find in your travels over the last 30 years and speaking to flute players and sax players that sax players are... They don't judge an instrument by the brand. They pick up the instrument, they blow it, and then they look at the name of the horn. Whereas flute players, I know because I've been in the business as long as you have, they look at the brand name, and then they tend to have this preconceived idea. What's your feelings on that?
Well, the feelings I have on that are that I think we all aspire to own something. We all need to own something, and there's various levels throughout. As a beginner, you need something which is going to make you sound good quickly. It's going to be robust. It's going to be in tune. It's going to be all of these things. But you always aspire to having that solid gold flute. That's that wonderful top end model that you always aspire to, and maybe we need that in our life in order to do. But there is a big difference between what you actually need as a player and what you wish to have as a player. And the thing I've found over the years is that people aspire to own very fine instruments, and that is a wonderful thing. But the people that have owned those instruments, that have had numerous of those instruments, are basically in a position to be able to help me, because they're not brand led at that point. They're actually looking at what the tool that they need. You very often find that saxophone players are more tuned in to a sound and what they need, and they're very fixated generally on vintage sound. So it's understanding what that is. And you're right, they don't really always care, because they've had them, they've owned them in the past. It's rolled over them, if you like, that aspirational side of it. What they're really into is looking after their careers and their sound and trying to get what they need. And of course, from a flute playing perspective, it tends to stop once a player has got that aspirational instrument. That sort of stops to some degree. But in saxophone world, it seems a little bit more open in my experience.
Yeah, same as mine. So let's move on to the flutes. Let's bypass the saxophones. But I wanted to bring the saxophone in, just as an example of you taking a student and step up brand line, as the TJ is known as, and actually breaking into the professional line of saxophones.
Yes.
Now, if we go back to the flute world, and the flute world is much bigger world than a much bigger market than the sax world. When you joined the company, we were very much known as a student brand, a student maker. And over the years, I think what you've brought is you've learnt, obviously, from all the products that we've distributed, and as a repairer and specialist repairer and speaking to people on how to sort of step up products. But you were very, and I know you believe in Kaizen, the Japanese process of continuous involvement, continuous improvement. Your idea of building things of a greater value and a greater standard, and then dropping those features and those manufacturing techniques down to lower models is an interesting concept, isn't it?
Yes, I would always try and do the best with the materials you've got and the opportunities you've got. So if you have access to a handmade facilities and everything else, then there is no reason why you shouldn't be able to produce a most perfect product. But when you're looking at a student instrument, the point is that what makes that flute good? What makes a flute good? What makes a flute suitable for the target market that you're aiming it at? And as a player, and as coming into the company as a player, that has always been my kind of, my driving force, really. It's trying to make sure that whatever you are doing, you're doing to the best of your ability and what you can and can't achieve.
That's obviously worked, David, because our entry flute, the TJ 10X, has won numerous awards, certainly in the UK and the Music Industry Award for being the best woodwind instrument of the year. Won it 3 times, I think. In the last year, or before pre-COVID, that is, you designed a head joint called the Voce, and you decided in your intimate wisdom that should be in 958 silver. But the key to it is not only designing a good head joint, put it in 958 silver, but sticking it on a step-up instrument.
I think players of all standards deserve the best that we can do. I don't think it should be all aspirational. I think there are players out there, as technology improves, as our ability to use materials improve, and the quality of that material improves. So we owe it to our players and to basically try and meet the sound that they need, really. So the whole 958 idea really is to try, and I think we've had our 925 heads on air flutes now for quite some years, and although we've undergone various cuts and various shapes and all sorts of things, I thought it was about time that we actually come up with something which is a bigger than a step up. It's a fairly sizable upgrade to what we were doing, and I've been very blessed with with some very good feedback on this head joint.
It's a stunner, David, and it's
Thank you.
It's a stunner, but something I don't know what it is. Why in 958 silver it gives you more than in 925? Yeah, I know there is something that is special, and I just find it interesting. Whereas all step up flutes out there, they all use 925, and obviously 925 silver is a cheaper. I mean, it's still expensive, but it's a cheaper material. Why go 958?
Well, why have silver flutes at all? Really, I think that's the point. I think over the over the years, I think silver, and we can head back to the wooden side of things later on. But the silver flute, the sterling silver, or a purer form of silver, has long been seen as being the sort of material of the sound of modern flute sound. The purity of that silver helps the sound too, because if we had a lower grade, lower than 925 silver, it would be a little brighter. It would have more other things in the alloys which may not react the same. But what I think as a flute world we've come to understand is that silver is a good working everyday material for the flute sound. The quality of the silver, the amount of pure silver in that alloy, and let's face it, 925 means 925 parts per thousand, as it were, of pure silver. 75 parts are other things. So the purer that silver can be, the better that sound can be as well. It's slightly warmer, it's slightly rounder, it has a different character. And I think that is really why we experiment with the materials in the flute world that we do. That's why not every single flute in the world is exactly the same material.
And good job as well.
Yeah, exactly. But some people like the gold sound. Some people like the nickel sound. It's harking back to the saxophone side. It's whether you like that brighter sound, whether you like that kind of rounder, bigger sound, that warmer sound, or whether you have to blend in with other people as an orchestral player or a band player. So really, it's a material thing. We've long since thought that silver is the material of choice for flutes, and therefore it seems logical to try and experiment with a slightly purer form of silver to see what happens to the sound.
So you develop probably the best head joint that TJ Flutes have ever had, and they are now available on all step-up silver head and silver tube flutes. But no sooner as if you do that and you put that into production, is that you deviate off really left field into an area that I really, really wasn't expecting, which is wooden flutes.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I've grown up with silver flutes. I've had a gold flute, but I've deviated back to silver with my gold Lafan head, which is really old Lafan head. And just a funny story of that, I didn't know it was white gold until you told me all those years ago. Until you cleaned it up and you said, this is white gold.
Exactly.
But you've deviated sort of I remember when you came to us and said, I think we need to, in the research and development meeting, I think we need to look at a wooden flute. I think my first reaction was thought the world of wooden flutes, it's either old wood, because what people won't know is we purchased the Flute Makers Guild Company of London many years ago, and we put it in hibernation. And we
protected it.
We protected it so that other people didn't come out with sort of Chinese copies or something. But obviously the Flute Makers Guild of London is known for its wooden flutes. Obviously Rudel Cart is known for its wooden flutes, but we're talking going back some. Modern days, you've also got the Powell wooden, you've got the phenomenal Sankyo wooden, and you've got some really, really beautiful, expensive wooden flutes out there. Why did you suddenly think or that there was a demand or an interest for an affordable wooden flute? So we're not talking about, China produce very cheap wooden flutes that they play, but there's nothing about them. They're all sort of made with, and they're rebadged. What made you decide to design a wooden flute that has all the characteristics of TJ?
A lot of things, really. I think a bit of vanity. I think there's always that need for people to be able to try these things at a level much the same as our own philosophy of flutes, at the level that works, that's good value for money, and that isn't an extreme of price. At the moment, if you want a wooden flute and you want the best that there is, it's handmade. It's fully handmade, and you will have to pay for that. So, in order to experience the sound of wood in a flute, you need to be able to do exactly what we've done all along, which is to produce a flute which is the best work you can, given the confines that you have, but give the best you can. Because there is a very real risk, if we're not careful, of us losing contact with the past and all of the experience and genius, quite frankly, of the makers that went before us.
Okay, but let's be open here, David. You have a bias. You have a bias because you are an aficionado even of Rudel Cart.
I stand on the shoulders of giants. I do a lot of reading. I have a lot of passion for the flute and the world, and I don't like to see us bowling forward into the 21st century having missed various things from the past. And I think that all of these flute makers from years ago had great ideas and some really good things to say, genius design, and yet we kind of in danger, if we're not careful, of allowing marketing and economics to rule the development of the flute, should we say. So we could end up with very cheap copies which aren't really flutes, if you know what I mean, in the best sense. They're kind of homages to something, but they're made at a price, but they're not representative of a flute maker's real work. So if I don't want to lose contact with the flute as an artistic instrument, and I don't want to lose all of the genius that's gone before us.
So when you play your old Rudel Cart, what do you feel? What do you hear when you play it? And then you play a normal flute. Can you feel? Or I mean, is it a psychological thing? You can feel history. You can feel something. Does it feel different when you play it? Does it feel different to response?
Yes, yes, they do. Very much so. I mean, I think a wooden flute, it really depends on how well it works, how well the embouchure is cut, how responsive it is. But I think once you go back to some of the older Rudel carts, you suddenly realise how blessed we've been for 100 years with embouchure holes in silver, because the whole idea of being able to generate power and flexibility and intonation and articulation on the flutes that we all have nowadays, is something that So when you go back to some of the older wooden flutes, you realise that you really did have to have an embouchure in order to get the best out of these instruments. So I think that is the first thing, is trying to. But I think the sense of history, and the sound is a wooden sound is a wooden sound. It's lovely to play. It's it sort of draws you in, and it's lovely to practice on, because you can actually, the whole thing, you can feel it as you play it. And a silver flute has become a really powerful, flexible, incredibly projecting instrument, which is fabulous for what we need in this day and age. But also, that wooden sound is something. There's something deep in all of us as flute players about that sound. And I think once you've experienced it and played it, you think, yeah, I really want to pursue this more. But it's doing it with a foot in each camp, because what we want to do is to try and produce a wooden flute which has a lot of the old attributes, but also a lot of the modern cuts and the modern responses. And that's been my kind of thing that I wanted to do. I wanted to find that middle ground where you can actually find a wooden flute that plays very well. The intonation hasn't been compromised in any way, and it's not going to cost the earth either. I think everyone deserves to try that wooden sound, even if it's just in a head joint.
So a couple of years ago, we gave you the freedom to start experimenting and create working prototypes, and we sort of butted out. We just thought, I must admit, I thought this would be a project as another project we're going to speak about in a second, but I thought this would be a project, because I know we make wooden head joints, and they're very good wooden head joints, but I thought this would be a project that you would, again, I thought it'd be a vanity project, that you wouldn't be able to meet the brief, which is an affordable wooden flute around about 5,000 US, I think. And anyway, that was the brief, with a really free blowing head joint, and actually looking, as you say, paying homage visually to the flutes of old. And then we went into lockdown. So I think there'd been 2 or 3 prototypes before that had gone out, and I know you were getting a lot of feedback on that. Then we went into lockdown, and a couple of the projects that you were working on obviously went into suspended animation, because we were not working, and we were furloughed over here in the UK. And then as recently as we've begun to unlock, and you've been going in occasionally, and messing around at home, as you probably do in your own workshop, you've you've finalised this this wooden prototype. I was lucky enough to have a honk on it a couple of weeks ago, and I was stunned. It wasn't like the prototype beforehand. I think you'd taken a hell of a lot of comment, and you just sort of changed everything, the way it blew, the resistance, the warmth, how it felt. And I know that in the last 2 weeks, you've sent it out to a few players, and the feedback has been stunning, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. Yeah. I think that what I wanted to try to do was to actually look at the whole tube, look at the whole flute, the whole wooden side of it, and just try and improve the intonation issues that wooden flutes tend to have because of joints and all sorts of things. Look at various build quality, try and utilize modern CNC cutting, for example, to try and make things accurately, to try and use a blend really of old materials and new engineering to try and find something which should be a proper wooden flute. And yes, again, as I said before, it's all to do with the players. If the players believe in what you're doing, then that is everything. That means everything, because at the end of the day, these are the people. It's us as players that are actually going to buy them and keep our business alive. But it's also the things that are going to outlast us as people. And it's this whole idea of things outlasting is quite important to me.
Yeah, I mean, the last person that received it, I mean, you do choose the experts, don't you? I mean, you sent it to Elizabeth Walker, who for all of her life has played on a wooden Flute Makers Guild flute.
Absolutely.
And has been in love with it, and she's tried so many wooden flutes. But I understand she loved it.
Yes, Liz was very kind and very generous about it in her time and her comments. And again, it just goes to show really that I think that if you've got the right attitude to what you're doing, and let's face it, we're trying to do this for the player, then the players themselves are interested in talking to you and working with you. And I think, yes, Elizabeth was very complimentary about it, and I thank her greatly for it. There's a few little tweaky things, of course, which need to be ironed out, and there's a few various options, because it ends up as a sort of what-if project. So there's various ideas that she shared with me, which I'm very grateful for, and yeah, I mean, it all adds to the strength of the product.
And I understand it will be soon be flying down under for the great Andy Nicholson in
Yes,
Perth to be
yes.
playing.
Yes, I'm just basically making sure that it's all good to go, and it will be on its way around the other side of the world, and we'll see what feedback there is from there. And on the back of that, we should be in production very shortly, probably middle of this year, if not before.
So what has really gobsmacked me is that I put out on social media, as you know, a couple of weeks ago, some pictures, just some teasing pictures of it, and I put out a very short reel, and the amount of people that came back, the feedback, the amount of pro players, professional players and orchestras who want to try it out, very interested in seeing if it could be a good second flute for them. It's really opened my eyes to the fact that it's all about producing quality, but at an affordable price. I mean, there's reason why handmade flutes are expensive. There is reason why,
absolutely.
because they're made by hand. Every part of it is made. They got the design, you've got the materials. You've taken your knowledge of Flute Makers Guild, of Rudelkart, and designed a wooden flute, but using modern day technology, as you say, to cut, with the exception of the head joint, I understand, and and trying to make an affordable wooden flute that will stand up as almost a professional wooden flute. Yeah, I've been proved wrong on that one.
I know. I think it's really to do with a piece of grenadilla is in one hand is going to be a joy, and in somebody else's hand is going to be a mess. And the point is that, I always use this fantastic, it came to me some years ago. It's like me building a brick wall. I could buy the best bricks in the world and I could make a complete hash of it. But somebody else who's been doing it for a long time would actually make something artistically joyful, exactly the same product. And of course, therein lies the difference. The point is that finding the right materials, finding the right people, getting the right advice, and having the right message, the right heart in what you're doing is what it's all about to me. And I think after that, you can actually put your hand on your heart and say, I've actually done the very best I can do, given the constraints I have, given the price, that I have. I've done everything I can to try and give the player value for money for what they need. And I think it's, hopefully it shows.
Well, certainly the prototype I've seen. And when obviously this won't be a mass-produced product because Grenadilla. I mean, let's face it, Grenadilla doesn't want to be Grenadilla. He wants to be a tree, doesn't it? It actually doesn't want to be a flute. So it's not won't be mass-produced. But when do you think the first ones will be available? Do you think it's sort of later in this year, sort of September time?
Oh, I certainly think yes. I certainly think at the latest. I would hope at the latest.
And are you only going to be doing Grenadilla, or will you eventually begin to move off?
Well, this again, we've got other projects going on, and we've got some very nice piccolos at the moment that I've been working on as well in the same way. And this has led on to this connection with the flutes. So we're working with 3 woods at the moment, mainly, which is basically the standard Grenadilla, and also a Mapani, and also Coca-Cola as well, to some degree, to see how we can work with those. So we have options. Obviously, it's the grain, it's the quality, it's the sustainability, it's all the other factors that matter so much. But all being well, we should be able to produce Mapani which is basically a redwood looking flute as well. We've already got our piccolos in production using this material as well. But generally, the wood, the wood is very, very sound, very, very good. And when you've got good materials and you have good colleagues and you've got good connections, then there's no excuse for not making a good product in my book.
Yeah, I apologise for not actually saying that your experience you gained in designing the Grenadilla and the TJ Rosewood piccolos you've brought into the flute, the design of the flutes. So let's move on to another completely crackers idea of yours, which I know is supported by my co-host on Talking Flutes, Claire Southworth, which is a flute with an open G sharp. Now, this flute, I do see the point of it because it's logical. But I've grown up on a normal flute, not an open G sharp flute. Why have you got so much passion for this instrument?
Because it's the original design, I think. It's the original scientific design for the flute from 170 years ago. Logically speaking, during the middle 1800s over here, when everything was in turmoil and everyone was trying to design the best flute, they wanted projection, intonation, they wanted it to be this, they wanted it to be that. There was so many ideas floating around at that point. What it needed was a scientific player to come up with the best answers. And I think Boehm did exactly that. Not just with the mechanism that we play, but with the cylindrical ball and everything, and open the door to solving so many problems on the flute that have been up to that point. And of course, he came up with such a radical design, such a change of design, that some of which we use today, but not all of it. And of course, I think the big bugbear, possibly in the back end of the 1800s, was the whole idea that everyone was used to playing a closed G-sharp flute. And so all of Boehm's ideas originally were to have an open G-sharp, which logically went down. So the G-sharp had one tone hole, the G had one tone hole. Everything was simple. It was structurally easier to make. It was scientific. And of course, I think that what we've done is to modify his original idea, and that's what we live with. And I think that it's a bit of an elephant in the room to me, because once you've played on an open G sharp and you've realised how powerful the middle of the register, the middle of that flute can be, how solid it can be, you suddenly think, oh, hang on, this isn't just an old-fashioned crazy idea. This has actually got some serious legs. And ever since that moment, that sort of moment of enlightenment, I've realised that what we haven't done over all these years is to look backwards enough to some of these people. And I think those people, I mean, Liz Walker plays an open G sharp FMG wooden flute as well, which was wonderful to hear. But I think you've got to try it to see what the benefits are. Now, it was a big move for players in the back end of the 1800s, and it's a bigger move now. However, I still think that it's very important that people shouldn't dismiss it completely, because it enables a flute maker to make a flute which is perfectly in tune. It makes so much sense to have it. It makes so much sense, but what it is a reversal of what you've learned. So people run scared of the whole idea. what but it really doesn't take very long to get used to an open G sharp when you start to play. It really doesn't. And once you start to realize just what it does for you as a player, especially with modern technology and modern engineering these days, and all of a sudden the flute comes alive, and it's quite remarkable. But no, my whole project with Claire and indeed yourself is really to try to give younger players who are starting on the flute the opportunity to be able to learn on one right from the start. So it's not really, it's a matter of trying to redress the imbalance, really. I think the whole closed G sharp idea in the flute world has kind of taken too much of a grip. And I think that, people treat the open G sharp as a little bit of a sort of craziness or whatever, but try it. So again, there was no reason why a manufacturer can't make an affordable entry-level 10x version, as it were, of an open G sharp flute, so that people can try it to see what they're missing, and if they like it, can teach on it as well. And then maybe gradually we can start to redress Bowen's in the imbalance, because he really did have a point back all those years ago.
Well, all I can say is, having sat through R&D meetings with you, and your passion with with open G sharp, my eyes just go back into my head as soon as you start talking about it. When I take the flute out, and you are right, you've designed and you've made the first run of student priced open G sharp silver plated flutes. When we've taken them out, there's been a hell of a lot of interest, and I'm actually quite surprised how many teachers are actually aware and how many teachers play on open G sharp. Now, I don't think that you'll change the world on this, David, but I suppose looking forward, your aim is obviously to reintroduce the open G sharp, or make it available to those that really want to have the option.
Exactly.
And then to move up the scale onto silver heads, silver tubes, and everything else.
Absolutely. Oh yes. I think the world deserves to know what these things are, for a start. So I think people need to know what that term means and what it is. When they do know what it is, have an option to be able to use one which isn't handmade, because at the moment it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. There's not enough people asking for them, so people won't make them. But the point is that somebody has to put their foot in the water and do it. And I think we as a company have got the ability to do that. And so first and foremost, people need to know what they are, what it is, and why. Why do that? So but I work on the basis, as we have done in the UK for many years, and I'm sure it was across Europe as well. The people that actually commission the building of cathedrals and castles very rarely live long enough to see the end of
it. That is very true.
And so I think that it's only right and proper that we do what we can to try and get this kind of branch of the flute world back in the public domain again, back where it should be, because I think that people will be very surprised when they actually see these things and try these things, at just how much control and power and intonation issues. With an open G sharp, there's no E mechanisms required, there's no donuts required, there's no E rings required. Middle E suddenly sounds properly. It's scientifically worked out. It's a very much easier system to make and very much easier system to play. And I think people deserve the right to try it themselves.
And for more information on that, if they just visit the tjflutes.com website, and you'll find the open G sharp model on there.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
David,
just one last thing before we go on that one, and that is that I fully intend to make this an option on any of their flute range going forward at some point. So even the wooden flutes themselves would be available as open G sharps in the future to special order.
Yeah, but briefly before we do sign off, this is obviously an ode to all the techs out there, the unseen techs. And for many years, David, you were beavering away back at Lenham and our base and never saw the light of day.
Yeah, still do.
But since you've been coming out more and obviously seeing more people, obviously you developed the copper alto, probably the world's most favourite alto flute, which is the copper-bodied alto. You've also developed a copper-body C flute, which has been out for about 18 months to 2 years now being tested.
Yep.
What was the logic behind going onto a copper tube? Because that flute is so light.
Well, it's an interesting concept, really, isn't it? I think we'll have to look at history and all the things that have been invented over the years, and then actually dig down and find out that actually it was an accident. That was found by accident. This was created by accident. And I'll put my hand up. The similar thing. We're working with saxophones, working with unlacquered saxophones, and the whole brass side and the high copper content side of materials, what it does, what it could do, what's real, what isn't real. And of course, we start looking at doublers on saxophones, and doublers on saxophones are very often after that lovely sultry sound that you get from alto flute. So I thought, well, maybe a raw alto might be something to have a look at trying. So we kind of had a sample made up with an unlacquered copper tube, brass tube, similar to the saxophones that we do, the signature custom. And I think we were all surprised at just how well that played. And it was one of those moments of eyebrow-raising moments where you think, "Oh, okay, so silver isn't the only instrument, the only material." And I think it was one of those moments, one of those special moments where you realise that something you've done for one thing is almost encapsulates something for everybody. So it wasn't just a jazz-orientated doublers instrument. All of a sudden, it became a bona fide, credible sound. And of course, alto flutes have got that kind of lower pitch and everything else, and it sort of lends itself to it. So timidly, I thought, well, it won't work on a concert flute for sure, but we'll try. We'll have a look. And yeah, there you are.
It does.
So all of a sudden, it does, and it does work. I mean, the sound producing side of things, I think, when it comes to the mouthpiece, when it comes to the head joint, when it comes to the cut and everything else, I still think that sound production needs to be in silver or something of that ilk. But the body and the overall sound and the feedback you get as a player through the instrument as you're playing it is remarkable. But it was an accident.
It's a beautiful accident, and I know we're having a meeting in a couple of weeks' time, but I can certainly see us going into production with the copper body C flute. It's been out, and it's a stonker. It plays really well. You've got a look of a gold flute, but it's copper. What made you go 85%? Was that the most copper content you could go before the copper tube became just too?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, luckily in the flute world, we have a fairly lightish instrument that's fairly small. I mean, the higher the copper, the softer the material, the more problems you get. So with regard to saxophones, there's a trade-off between hardness and sound, and we found it at that sort of point. We're moving into 90%, 92% copper in soprano saxophones, by the way, as well as at the moment, which is sounding really nice. But generally, with regard to the saxophones themselves, the altos, the tenors, the 85% was a good point to be at, and we just transferred that over to the flute to see what happened. But there's plenty of experimenting to do, really.
I love accidents, and from where the company sits, it's refreshing. I mean, if people know the techs they go to, the technical specialists, they're all very modest. I mean, if I had invented the copper alto or the copper C flute or the wooden flute or the piccolo and put it into production, the world would have known about it. But David, you beaver away in the background and you give us samples, and I may be cynical to start with, but when I try them, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, I'll actually doff my cap and say, really, really well done. And that's the thing with the techs and the people who design the unseen heroes. Everybody sees people in flute stores because they give you the flutes, and then you remember the person that sold you the flute, but you don't know the journey that piece of tree, if we're looking at the wooden flute, has had from being a tree to being that instrument that you're testing. And I, from all the team at the company, thanks a lot for all the hard work you put in and continue to put in. What is your?
It's my life, really.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It must make you extremely boring, but I'm only joking. I'm only joking, by the way. I'm only joking.
I'm not always that way. I'm usually thinking about things, trying to solve issues and problems, which I think you'll find every technician in the whole world is like that.
Yeah,
because really, it's a lateral thinking kind of game, really, in many ways. But I think that it doesn't matter what your passion is in life, whether it's motor cars or whatever it is. I mean, if you start talking to other people that are passionate as you are and are motivated enough to become good repairers and good technicians, then that's a joy to me. And the point is that, you can share information, you can actually learn so much, and you can pass on so much. But ultimately, what I want to do is to keep the passion in what we do, and not let the economics and that steamroller of economics completely ruin what we have as players. I mean, our instrument has been a long time in development, you know, over the years, and we shouldn't allow economics to ruin any forward thinking. But my philosophy is also not just to talk to other people and to share information, but also to look backwards as much as forwards, because there are people in the past whose names have been long forgotten to history, who had 100 times more knowledge than I do, and 100 times more ability than I do. And I respect their input as much as anybody else's.
Well, that's very admirable. It's why you do what you do, and you're an extremely fine brush person, whereas I'm more of I'm not even a roller. I'm a sort of more of a steamroller. I don't.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there are things in life, John Paul, that do require a soft touch. And I think you'll find there's more of that than you think there is.
Yeah, indeed. So what's your long I mean, once you've got the wooden flutes developed, and once the open G sharp is, well, it's out now, and it's being pushed through now we're out of COVID, and you've got the wooden heads that are going to be available to fit all brands of flutes, and it'd be I think be the first affordable wooden head. Again, affordable wooden head to go on any flute.
Yes.
What's long term? I know you've got a passion for trying to bring the Brosser F sharp back. What is your long term? Do you have any long term, or are you just working month to month?
Some and some, really. Some and some. I mean, life is all about the day-to-day existence and keeping bread and butter on the table, as it were. But there's also that dream quality. There's also that kind of things that, you know, that drive you. I mean, in looking at the drive, I mean, yes, it would be nice to be able to redress balances, I think, going forward. I think that would be the nice thing. And it would be great to be able to see our flute world actually developing and more people enjoying physically playing our instruments, rather than turning to, you know, some of the electronics, keeping the woodwind alive, really, and keeping it vital and real, and keeping it realistic, making sure that we're not going down one alley to the detriment of another. So going forward, I just like to be doing what I'm doing as long as I can, really. Well, as long as people will put up with it.
What's interesting for us as a company is most companies are run very certain ways, very much on a business perspective. And I think it was about 10 years ago, we decided to turn that on their head and be run by what our technical team were bringing to the table. Because there's a lot of good flutes out there, there's a lot of good piccolos, but we wanted to be different. And to be different, I think you need to have your instruments developed by the people who know what the market wants, rather than you telling the market, look at this great new flute. And
very much so.
And that's why we don't try and market anything. It all comes from the players. If the players like something, it's because it's been developed with the players.
Exactly.
And so I can see this continuing well on into the future, David, until you and I are both walking into the office with walking sticks.
Exactly. Well, I just like to say at this moment that in the last 30 years, I've probably met the most amazing people in this world. And it's down to them that I have to doff my hat and say thank you to all them for putting up with me and my silly questions and all that over the years. But generally, there are some phenomenal makers out there. There are some phenomenal people, all of which are doing some fabulous work. They're keeping all their instruments working and repaired and everything else. And all of them have a lifetime of experience. And I want to discuss it with everybody. I want to talk about it.
Yeah,
I want to be strong from that.
And you're not just a talker and then don't do it. You're actually, I've known you come back and stop production to do tweaks based around findings from repairers and findings from other players. So
yes, definitely.
That bang, by the way, was my Bedlington mouse just slamming the door shut, which is quite interesting. So I've taken up a lot of your time, your working time, David, and I know you're working on.
Yes, I'm back to the coal face in a moment, and working on some flutes to go to another country somewhere. I can't remember which one it is at the moment, but
I know.
Still working. So I'm very much a hands-on person. I sort of, you know, I have my own workbench amongst everybody else, and I prefer it that way. I want to be there at the grassroots with everybody. So I'm going to head back to mine.
And Dave is really approachable. If you've got any comments or any ideas or any thoughts, then you can just go into any of our social media, the TJ Flute social media. That's on Instagram at TJ Flutes, Facebook on Trevor James Flute, and drop us a message, and then I'll make sure David gets to see it, because you actually do like hearing from people, don't you?
Oh, I do. No, absolutely. It's a small world that we live in the flute world and the saxophone world, and and we should all know each other, and we should all be able to talk to each other. So doors are open, communication is always open, and I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, David, and wishing you a great day, and I'll catch up with you probably, I think it's next week.
Thank you.
Thanks again,
it's been
David.
A pleasure.
So thanks to David, and thank you for listening this week. Don't forget to give the podcast a like or follow on the various podcast provider you're listening on, especially if you're on Apple Podcasts, as this helps the various algorithms to make sure that Talking Flutes can be found easily. We love hearing from you, so also keep the messages coming to us by email at flutepodcasts@gmail.com. I'm back again next week with another Talking Flutes Extra. So until then, keep smiling, keep practicing, and may your top F sharp be particularly beautiful. Mine never is. Goodbye. Talking Flutes and Talking Flutes Extra are podcast productions by the Trevor James Flute Company. For more information, visit trevorjamesflutes.com.